My mother stood up at my father's retirement dinner, tapped her glass with a fork, and announced that she and my father were giving my sister $50,000 toward her first house, and when I asked, gently, whether they'd thought about helping both of us, she looked at me in front of 40 of my father's former coworkers and said, "We're not made of money, Larkin. Besides, you've always managed just fine on your own. You've never really needed us for anything." 11 minutes later, a family friend I hadn't warned about any of this stood up to give her own toast, and accidentally told that entire room the one thing I'd spent 4 years making absolutely sure nobody ever found out. I want you to picture the room first, because the room matters. My parents had rented the banquet space at the community center on the east side of Columbus, the same room where the plant used to hold its holiday parties back when my father still worked there. String lights taped along the drop ceiling. A sheet cake reading "Congratulations, Alistair, 34 years" in blue icing on the dessert table. I'd landed at John Glenn International 4 hours earlier, at the tail end of a transatlantic rotation, and driven straight from the airport, still half in my uniform, because I wasn't going to miss my father's retirement dinner for anything, including the 11 hours of sleep my body was owed. My sister Marnie was already there when I arrived, seated close to our parents the way she always is, close enough that when my mother made her announcement, the $50,000, the down payment, the little speech about how proud they were watching Marnie finally settle into a place of her own, Marnie's hand found our mother's on the tablecloth almost automatically, the two of them fitting together the way people do when they've had years of practice standing that close. I didn't ask my question to embarrass anyone. I asked it quietly, leaning toward my mother while the applause was still dying down, mostly because 4 years of carrying something heavy by myself had worn a thin, honest crack straight through my ability to just let a moment like that pass without saying anything at all. I asked whether they'd thought about doing something similar for me someday, when the time came. And my mother, not unkindly exactly, in the specific tone she uses when she believes she's being reasonable rather than cruel, told an entire banquet room full of my father's former coworkers that I had never really needed anyone. I want you to stay with me for this one, because in about 10 minutes, a woman named Priscilla Aldrich is going to stand up to give a toast of her own. And she is going to say one sentence that neither she nor anyone else in that room has any idea is about to change the entire shape of that evening. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, I tell true, quiet stories like this one most nights, and the ones without a single raised voice in them tend to be the ones people remember longest. The check my sister received that night is real, and so is the number Priscilla Aldrich said out loud about 10 minutes later, and I promise you the second one is bigger. If you've ever smiled and said nothing while a room decided, out loud, that you'd never really needed anyone, stay with me. This is that story, from the very beginning. I should tell you about Columbus first, and about the specific kind of household Marnie and I grew up in, because it explains almost everything that came later. My father spent 34 years as a maintenance technician at a manufacturing plant on the west side of the city. The kind of job where you know your pension to the dollar a decade before you retire. And my mother did the books part-time for a small accounting firm downtown, careful, precise work she was genuinely good at. They built their whole understanding of a stable life around one central idea: staying close, staying reachable, staying put. It gave them a paid-off split level and 2 daughters who never once doubted they were loved. It just never made much room for a life that looked, from their kitchen table, like it had wandered too far from home. I was the daughter who wandered. I joined the Navy Reserve at 19 partly for the flight training, spent 6 years flying regional routes for a commuter airline after I left active service, and worked my way up, slowly and unglamorously, to captain on wide-body international routes for a major carrier by the time I was 32. It is, by any honest measure, a demanding, well-compensated, deeply serious profession, 4-day rotations to Frankfurt and Seoul, responsibility for hundreds of lives every time I take a runway. A schedule that changes every single month and answers to nobody's convenience, but the airlines. To my parents, for years, it mostly just meant I was gone. I remember trying, early on, to explain the actual mechanics of the job to my father, the years of accumulated flight hours before a regional carrier would even look at my application, the type ratings, The recurrent training every 6 months that never really stops for the entire length of a career. The fact that a captain seniority number determines literally everything about your life, your schedule, your routes, your ability to be home for a specific birthday 2 years in advance. He listened, nodded in the right places, and eventually asked whether I thought I'd ever want something with more regular hours, once you're ready to settle down. I was 29 at the time, already flying international. I don't think he meant it as a diminishment. I think, genuinely, our family's working vocabulary simply didn't have a slot for a job that measured its seriousness in something other than physical proximity. Marnie went the other direction. She stayed in Columbus after community college, took an administrative assistant job at a law firm downtown, and never lived more than 15 minutes from our parents' house. She's there for every Sunday dinner, every doctor's appointment, every small emergency that comes up on a Tuesday afternoon. I want to be fair to her, because none of what follows is really her fault. She built a life in the shape our parents already understood, showing up in person, week after week, in a way my schedule has simply never allowed me to match. And she was rewarded for that with an ease of trust I've never quite managed to earn myself, not because she asked for it, but because presence is a currency my parents have always valued more than almost anything else. Marnie met Rhett, a claims adjuster with a steady, easygoing manner, when she was 26, and the two of them settled into exactly the kind of life our parents had always modeled for us, a rented townhouse a few miles from Mom and Dad. Dinner at my parents' table most Sundays, a 5-year plan that included, eventually, the house my mother had just announced she was helping fund. None of this makes Marnie calculating or unkind. She simply never had to build her sense of belonging around proving anything, because her whole adult life had unfolded in exactly the shape our family already knew how to recognize as love. I want to be fair about how the imbalance accumulated too, because it never came from one cruel decision, it came from 100 small ones, the kind that only look unkind once you finally lay them all out side by side, which is exactly the arithmetic nobody in a family wants to be the first to do out loud. My parents covered most of Marnie's community college tuition without much discussion. When I chose the reserve partly to fund my own flight hours, my mother asked, more than once, whether I'd really thought that through. The Christmas Marnie got engaged to Rhett, my parents hosted an engagement dinner with a cake and a toast. When I made captain 2 years ago, a promotion that took 11 years and 3 type ratings to reach, my mother mentioned it to exactly one person at church, in passing, and referred to it afterward as Larkin's flying thing going well. Our town, really our whole extended orbit of aunts, uncles, and my parents' longtime friends from the plant and the church, is small enough in its social circuits that everyone circulates through the same handful of places, the same grocery store on Sawmill Road, the same Sunday service, the same summer cookouts at my uncle's place on the reservoir. There's a particular kind of exposure that comes with that overlap. My Aunt Colette once remarked, at a 4th of July gathering years ago, watching Marnie help our mother carry dishes in from the porch, "Isn't it nice, having a daughter who's actually around?" in a tone that was clearly meant as praise for Marnie and clearly wasn't thinking about how it landed on the daughter standing 3 feet away holding a bowl of potato salad. I smiled and carried the bowl inside, the way you learn to let 100 small comments go so they don't have to become one large conversation at a cookout. There was a specific evening, about a year before this retirement dinner, that I still think about. I'd flown in for one night between rotations specifically to see my parents, and my mother spent most of dinner talking about a leak under Marnie's kitchen sink that Rhett had fixed that weekend, genuinely delighted by it, the way you're delighted by a small, visible act of care. I sat there in my one evening home that whole month and understood, not for the first time, that the specific kind of care I was capable of giving, the kind that requires distance, that shows up as an international wire transfer or a call from a layover instead of a Tuesday afternoon in person, simply didn't register to my mother as care at all. It registered as absence. I want to be fair to my own choices here too, because I don't think I was purely a passive victim of a family that misjudged me. I chose this career knowing exactly what it would cost me in physical presence, and I chose, for years, not to fight very hard against my parents' particular language for love, mostly because the alternative, sitting my mother down and explaining carefully that a wire transfer from a layover in Doha was its own form of devotion, felt exhausting in a way that never seemed worth the effort on any single ordinary week. It only started to feel worth naming once I noticed how consistently the story got told the same way, year after year, at every gathering, until it had hardened into something closer to a fact about me than an opinion anyone might still reconsider. I should say plainly that none of this ever came from real unkindness. My parents are not cruel people, and I don't believe either of them ever consciously decided that Marnie mattered more than I did. It built the way these things usually do, through years of individually forgivable choices that only look unfair once you finally add them all up, which is exactly the kind of arithmetic I'd spent most of my adult life quietly declining to do. Mostly because doing it out loud felt like an accusation against two people who had, in every other real way, given both of us a genuinely stable childhood. I believed, mostly, that it evened out in ways that didn't need to be spoken, that my parents loved both of their daughters fully, just in a language weighted toward the one who was easier to reach. I believed that all the way up until a Tuesday afternoon 4 years before this retirement dinner, when my phone lit up on a layover in Dubai with a message from Marnie that read, in full, "Dad's in the hospital. It's his heart. Come home if you can." I want to walk you through those 4 years ago days carefully, because the timing turned out to matter more than almost anything else in this story. My father had a myocardial infarction on a Tuesday morning while walking the dog, was in surgery within 6 hours for a triple bypass, and by the time I'd gotten myself off a wide body over the Atlantic, rerouted through 2 connections, and landed back in Columbus, 31 hours had passed. 31 hours in which Marnie had been at the hospital continuously, sleeping in a waiting room chair, making decisions in real time alongside our mother, while I was somewhere over international water with my phone in airplane mode, entirely unreachable, doing the one job that had, at that exact moment, made it structurally impossible for me to be the daughter who showed up first. I want to be precise about the medical details, because precision matters to me and because I think it helps explain why the gap ended up as large as it did. The initial bypass surgery itself was, in the strict sense, covered under my parents' insurance, subject to their deductible and standard cost sharing. What pushed the total so far past what anyone expected was a second, unplanned procedure 4 days later when a graft showed early signs of narrowing, followed by an extended ICU stay that ran nearly triple the average length for a case like his, followed by 6 weeks of a specialized cardiac rehabilitation program his cardiologist considered essential rather than optional. Insurance treated each of those as a separate negotiation, and by the time the hospital's billing office had finished reconciling everything against what the plan would actually pay, the gap between covered and owed sat, precisely, at $84,612, a number everyone in the family, myself included, simply started rounding to $85,000 within the first week, the way exact figures often soften into round ones once they stop being an active crisis and start being a story you tell. By the time I arrived, my father was stable, recovering, and the family had already absorbed the first wave of financial reality. The surgery itself was covered, mostly, but a series of complications, a second, unplanned procedure, an extended ICU stay, a rehabilitation program our father's cardiologist strongly recommended, had pushed the total bill to a number that exceeded what our parents' insurance would cover by $85,000. I remember sitting in that hospital cafeteria with my mother, watching her do math on the back of a napkin, watching her face while she considered, out loud, whether they'd need to take a second mortgage on a house they'd worked 30 years to pay off free and clear. Marnie had already looked into a personal loan for her share and mentioned, carefully, that Rhett's family might be able to help with a portion, and I remember sitting there and understanding, with a kind of clarity that only arrives during a genuine crisis, that the family had essentially already started solving this problem without me, not out of malice, but out of simple logistics, because I'd been unreachable for the exact 31 hours when the plan started forming, and by the time I landed, the shape of the solution was already half built around people who'd been in the room the whole time. I sat in on the family meeting that evening anyway, my father resting upstairs, the three of us, my mother, Marnie, and I, going through the hospital's itemized estimate line by line at the kitchen table. The same table where my mother had once asked if I'd really thought through joining the reserve. My mother kept circling back to the same anxious refrain that they'd worked their whole lives to pay off that house free and clear and now might have to remortgage it in their 60s, her voice tight in a way I'd rarely heard from her. Marnie, for her part, was already pulling up loan calculators on her phone, running numbers, doing exactly the kind of practical, present, hands-on problem-solving she has always been genuinely excellent at. I sat there mostly listening, still jet-lagged, still absorbing the fact that my father's heart had nearly stopped on a sidewalk 2 days earlier, and said very little about what I might be able to contribute because I genuinely hadn't worked out yet, in any concrete way, what that number even was. I didn't say anything that week about what I was actually capable of contributing. Part of that was timing. I genuinely hadn't done the math yet on what 11 years of captain's pay, careful investing, and a Navy pension had actually put me in a position to do. But part of it, if I'm honest, was something else, a flash of the exact feeling I'd been swallowing quietly for years, the sense that whatever I offered would be received as a gesture from the daughter who'd been unreachable when it mattered, rather than as the substantial thing it actually was. I didn't want to hand over a check and watch my mother thank me the way you thank someone for showing up late to help clean up a mess they'd already mostly cleaned themselves. I sat with that feeling for exactly 4 days before I acted on it, long enough to be sure it wasn't simply pride talking, long enough to watch Marnie and my mother continue assembling a loan and family contribution plan that was going to work, technically. But that was also going to leave my parents carrying debt into their 60s on top of a health scare that had already frightened all of us badly. On the 5th day, sitting in a hotel room between rotations, I opened my own accounts, did the actual math for the first time, captain's pay, 11 years of careful investing, a Navy pension I'd never touched, and understood, with real clarity, that I could absorb the entire gap myself without meaningfully disrupting my own life at all. The only real question left was how. So I did something else instead. I called a lawyer I'd worked with years earlier on an unrelated matter, a woman named Priscilla Aldrich who specializes in estate and trust work, and asked her, plainly, how to pay an $85,000 hospital bill without my name ever touching it. She walked me through the mechanics over 2 phone calls, a properly structured anonymous trust, funded by me, that would work directly with the hospital's billing office to satisfy the outstanding balance, processed and documented in a way that would appear, from my parents' side of the paperwork, indistinguishable from a hospital financial assistance adjustment. I signed what needed signing, wired what needed wiring, and 3 weeks later my mother called me, almost giddy with relief, to tell me the hospital had come through with some kind of charity program and reduced the outstanding balance to nearly nothing. I told her that was wonderful news. I meant it, too, it was wonderful news, just not in the shape she believed it was. I hung up the phone that day and sat in my car outside base operations for a long time, feeling something I hadn't fully expected, not resentment, and not quite peace either, but a strange, private steadiness. The specific feeling of having quietly done something enormous for people I loved and having absolutely no plan, then or ever, to spend that fact on being seen differently by them. The 4 years between that hospital cafeteria and my father's retirement dinner were, for the most part, entirely ordinary, and I want to walk through the shape of them carefully, because the ordinariness is most of the point. My father recovered well, went back to work 8 months after his surgery, and eventually made it, healthy and intact, to the 34-year mark he'd always talked about as his real finish line. Life in Columbus continued the way it always has, Marnie at every Sunday dinner, every small emergency, every doctor's follow-up appointment, me flying in when I could, 4 or 5 visits a year, always arriving a little tired, always leaving a little too soon. My mother never stopped mentioning, gently, how much she wished I lived closer, and I never stopped explaining, gently, that the job simply didn't allow it. 2 sentences that had been circling each other, unresolved, for over a decade by that point. There was a period, roughly a year into the arrangement, when the secret nearly surfaced by accident in an entirely different way. My mother, going through old paperwork to prepare their own taxes, found a reference number on a bank statement that didn't quite match anything she recognized, and called me, mildly curious, asking if I knew anything about an odd line item on their account. I told her, truthfully as far as it went, that I didn't recognize it either, and suggested she call the bank directly if it kept bothering her, a small, deliberate evasion that sat uneasily with me for weeks afterward. The first time I understood that keeping this secret wasn't just going to cost me comparisons at Sunday dinner, it was occasionally going to require me to actively steer my own mother away from a truth sitting one phone call away from her. If you've ever paid for something huge and let someone else believe it came from anywhere but you, because some part of you had already stopped expecting to be believed even if you told the truth, drop the trust in the comments below. I have a feeling more of you have sat in a parking lot exactly like the one outside base operations that afternoon than you'd expect. I saw Priscilla twice a year or so for unrelated matters, updating my own estate paperwork, a question about a rental property Adrian and I had bought, and every time, some part of the conversation would drift, briefly and carefully, toward the trust. Mostly just her confirming the account was still properly sealed, still fully anonymous, still functioning exactly as designed. She never once treated the arrangement as strange. Plenty of people do exactly what you did, she told me once, organizing paperwork across her desk. Most families just never find out. That's usually the whole point. I want to be honest that keeping this secret cost me something specific and recurring, a particular kind of tax I paid at almost every family gathering for 4 straight years. There was a Thanksgiving 2 years after the surgery, when my mother told a table full of relatives how grateful she still was for that hospital program, genuinely moved. Genuinely believing in a kindness that had never actually come from the hospital at all, and I sat there and passed the stuffing and said nothing, because correcting her in that moment would have meant making my father's health crisis, retroactively, about me. There was a birthday dinner, more recently, when my mother mentioned, almost as an aside, that Marnie had been the one who really held this family together during that whole ordeal. True, in its way. About the parts of holding a family together that happen in a hospital waiting room in person, and I let that stand too, because it was also true, just not the whole truth. And I decided a long time ago that the whole truth wasn't mine to hand out just to win a comparison. There was another moment, closer to the 2nd anniversary of the surgery, when Marnie mentioned, offhand, that she looked briefly into whether the hospital's charity program was something other families in similar situations could apply for, thinking she might pass the information along to a coworker whose mother was facing a comparable gap. I remember the specific lurch of panic that went through me, and the careful, deflecting answer I gave her about how these programs usually have very narrow, case-by-case eligibility rules, true enough as a general statement, and just specific enough to close the conversation without either confirming or denying anything real. I hated lying to my own sister about it, even indirectly. I did it anyway, because the alternative felt, at the time, like unraveling something I'd already decided wasn't mine to unravel on anyone else's schedule but my own. My husband, Adrian, is the only other person besides Priscilla who has known the full shape of it from the beginning. He's an architect, methodical by profession and by nature, and he asked me once, maybe a year in, whether I regretted not simply telling my parents the truth and letting them feel whatever they were going to feel about it. I told him I didn't know yet. I think, for years later, I finally do. I didn't tell them because some part of me had already concluded, long before the hospital bill ever existed, that the truth wouldn't actually change how my parents saw me. That it would just become one more fact about me they didn't quite know how to file, the same way they'd never quite known how to file 11 years of captain's pay or a promotion I'd worked a decade for. There's a version of this story where I eventually got tired enough of the silent tax to simply sit my parents down and tell them plainly, and I want to be honest that I came close to that exactly once, about 18 months in, on a night when my mother, at a family dinner, spent nearly 20 minutes praising Marnie's steadiness during that whole scare, while I sat 2 feet away having personally paid for the resolution of that scare. I remember driving to the airport hotel afterward with the whole explanation half composed in my head, the specific sentence I was going to open with. I never said it. Somewhere on that drive, I decided the timing would always feel wrong, that there would always be a reason it seemed more like a grievance than a gift if I brought it up myself, and that the only version of the truth I'd ever be fully at peace with was one that arrived on its own, without my hand visibly on the scale. I want to be precise about something else, too, because it matters for what happens later. I never once, in 4 years, imagined a scenario where the secret came out in a room full of people. If I'd pictured it coming out at all, I'd have pictured a quiet conversation, just the 4 of us, maybe over coffee, me finally deciding the weight had gotten to be too much to carry alone. I never once imagined a banquet hall, a sheet cake, and a woman I trusted completely standing up with a champagne glass in her hand, about to say a sentence she had absolutely no idea was a secret at all. In the weeks leading up to the retirement dinner, my mother had thrown herself into planning it with a specific, almost ceremonial energy. The banquet room booked 8 weeks out, the guest list expanded twice to include coworkers going back 3 decades, a slideshow of photos from my father's career that she'd spent an entire weekend assembling. I flew in the day before to help with logistics where I could, running errands between naps to fight off the jet lag, and I remember standing in my parents' kitchen the night before the dinner, helping my mother count out place cards, feeling something close to real contentment about the whole occasion, no sense at all of what the next evening actually held. Priscilla arrived at my father's retirement dinner about 20 minutes before the toasts began, invited as a family friend as much as an advisor at this point, having handled enough of my parents' own estate planning over the years to have earned a standing invitation to things like this. I remember watching her come through the door, waving to my mother, completely relaxed, completely unaware that she was walking into the one room on earth where a specific sentence she was about to say carried 4 years of weight behind it. So we're back in the banquet room, the one I opened with the string lights, the sheet cake, my mother's announcement about Marnie's $50,000 still settling over the tables, my own questions still hanging in the air along with my mother's answer to it. I want to walk you through the next 15 minutes slowly, because I've replayed them enough times myself that I think I owe you the same care. Dinner continued around us the way these things do, my father's old coworkers coming by our table in 2s and 3s to shake his hand, tell a story about some incident on the plant floor 15 years back, congratulate him properly on 34 years. My mother, Vivian, glowed through all of it, genuinely happy, genuinely proud of my father in a way that had nothing performative about it, which is part of what made the earlier moments so hard to sit with. She wasn't a villain that night. Not in any way you could point to cleanly. She was just a woman comfortable enough in a long-held belief about her daughters that she'd said it out loud, in public, without registering it as a wound at all. My sister Marnie found me near the dessert table about 10 minutes later, holding a small plate of cake she clearly hadn't touched, and said, quietly, that she hadn't known Mom was going to make the announcement that way, in front of everyone, without checking with me first. I believed her. Marnie has never once, in her life, orchestrated a moment specifically to make me feel smaller. She simply lives, comfortably, inside a family structure that was already built that way long before either of us had any say in it. I told her I wasn't upset with her, which was true, and she squeezed my arm and went back to sit with Rhett, and I stood there by the cake for a minute with my own thoughts, watching my mother work the room, feeling the familiar quiet of having just been defined, out loud, in front of 40 people, as someone who had never really needed anyone. My husband Adrian found me a minute later, having caught the tail end of the exchange from across the room, and didn't say anything about it directly, just stood next to me, close. The specific quiet support of 12 years of marriage that doesn't need narrating. I saw Priscilla a few tables over, deep in a conversation with one of my father's old supervisors, entirely unaware that anything had happened at our table at all, and some part of me, watching her laugh at whatever the supervisor had just said, thought, with real fondness, how strange it was that the one person in that room who knew the truest thing about my last 4 years had absolutely no idea a truth like that was even sitting in the room with her. I want to be honest that I considered, standing there by the dessert table, simply letting the evening pass the way it was already headed, smiling through the rest of dinner, driving back to my hotel near the airport. Flying out again in 36 hours the way I always do, carrying the same quiet weight I'd already carried for 4 years without much visible strain. I'd gotten genuinely good at that particular kind of carrying. Some part of me still half expected that's exactly how the night would end. The event coordinator tapped a microphone near the front of the room around 8:30, announcing it was time for a few words before dessert service wrapped up, and my father's closest friend from the plant floor went first, a warm, funny, well-worn speech about 34 years of coffee breaks and near misses on the loading dock, the kind of toast a room like that one is built for. My mother went next, tearful and genuine, thanking my father for a life she clearly considered, without complication, to have been a good one. I clapped along with everyone else and meant it, because none of what had happened earlier changed the fact that my parents' marriage, whatever its blind spots toward me, was a real and steady thing worth celebrating. Priscilla stood up third, glass in hand, explaining briefly to the room that she'd known Alistair and Vivian for close to a decade through her work, that she considered them genuine friends rather than just clients, and that she wanted to say a few words about the kind of quiet care this family had shown each other over the years she'd watched them. I felt something tighten in my chest the second she said quiet care, a small, specific alarm I couldn't yet name, though some part of me, in hindsight, had probably already guessed exactly where the next 15 seconds were headed. She talked for a minute or so about small, safe things first, how organized my mother kept every document Priscilla had ever needed from her, how my father always remembered to ask about Priscilla's own kids by name. The specific comfort of working with clients who'd become, over 10 years, closer to friends than a professional file. The room was warm and a little restless in the pleasant way rooms get near the end of a long dinner, half listening, half finishing their cake, and I remember scanning the tables and finding my mother's face lit with the same open, unguarded pride she'd worn through every toast so far that night. A few of my father's old coworkers near the front had gone quiet to listen properly, the way a room does for a speaker it doesn't fully recognize, but senses is about to say something with real weight behind it. Someone near the back refilled a water glass, the small clink of it oddly loud in the pause Priscilla left before continuing. My father sat with his hands folded on the table, watching her with the same open, slightly tired warmth he'd worn all evening, 34 years of a working life finally, officially behind him. No reason on earth to expect the next sentence out of her mouth to be anything other than another kind word about a decade of friendship. I found myself, in that suspended half-second, running through the actual odds in my head, the way you do when you're bracing for something you can't yet be sure is really coming. Priscilla was a careful, professional woman who had spent a decade building exactly the kind of discretion her work requires. There was no obvious reason tonight would be different from any other night she'd sat at my parents' table. And yet something about the specific phrase she'd already used, quiet care, the years she'd watched this family, sat in my chest like the opening bars of a song I already recognized, one I'd been quietly dreading hearing in public for 4 full years. I thought, in that stretched-out second, about every version of this exact fear I'd carried quietly through 4 years of ordinary dinners, the reference number on a bank statement, the offhand question from Marnie about charity programs. 100 smaller moments where the truth had come close enough to the surface that I could feel its outline through the water without it ever quite breaking through. I'd gotten so genuinely good at managing those moments, one at a time, that some part of me had started to believe I could keep doing it indefinitely, that 4 years of successful containment meant I'd simply built something sturdy enough to hold forever. Adrian's hand tightened slightly around mine, and I glanced at him just long enough to see that he'd arrived at the same instinct I had, the two of us bracing together for a sentence neither of us could actually stop once it started. Across the room, my mother was still watching Priscilla with the same open, unguarded warmth, entirely unprepared, entirely unaware that the next few words were about to rearrange everything she believed she understood about the last 4 years of her own family's life. Priscilla lifted her glass another inch, the small, practiced gesture of someone approaching the close of a toast, glancing briefly down at my parents' table with the same easy, unhurried affection she'd shown all evening, no hesitation in her at all. No sense whatsoever that the sentence sitting in her mouth was anything other than one more warm, well-earned compliment for two people she genuinely, deeply admired. I glanced at Adrian beside me, and he must have felt the same small current I was feeling, because his hand found mine under the table without either of us saying anything. Across the room, Priscilla shifted her weight, glass still raised, clearly working her way toward whatever specific note she wanted to land the toast on, and I felt, with a kind of dread I can only describe as fully physical, the exact shape of the sentence coming before she ever said it, the way you sometimes know, half a second before it happens, exactly which word a person is about to reach for. If you've ever watched someone you trust completely pick up a microphone with absolutely no idea they were about to say the one sentence you'd spent 4 years making sure nobody ever said, you already know exactly the particular held breath feeling I'm describing right now, and I promise you, what Priscilla says next is the reason I've been telling you to stay with me this whole time. Drop the toast in the comments if you want to know the exact sentence that changed everything in that room. And of course, Priscilla continued, smiling warmly at my parents, raising her glass a little higher. None of us will ever forget how well that whole scare with your heart turned out, Alistair. Thank goodness for that trust that came through when it mattered most. My father's smile faltered first, the particular confusion of a man hearing a phrase that doesn't match any file he has stored away. What trust? He asked, mostly to Priscilla, though his eyes had already started drifting toward my mother, then toward me, some instinct in him clearly beginning to assemble pieces faster than the rest of the room. Priscilla's expression shifted in real time, a warm toast curdling into visible uncertainty as she realized, mid-sentence, that the sentence she'd just said out loud was landing on faces that had no context for it at all. She glanced at me, one quick, apologetic, searching look. Are you telling me this was a secret? And I understood, in that half second, that there was no version of the next 30 seconds where I got to keep carrying this alone anymore. The trust, Priscilla said, more carefully now, setting her glass down, that covered the gap in your surgery bill 4 years ago. The $85,000 your insurance didn't cover. She looked around the table, at my mother's stunned, still face, at my father's growing confusion, and understood, fully now, that she had just said something nobody in that family had ever been told. I'm so sorry, I assumed you all knew. I set it up. Larkin came to me about 6 weeks after the surgery and asked me to structure it so it would never trace back to her. The room didn't go completely silent. A banquet hall full of 40 people doesn't have that kind of silence available to it, but our table did, entirely, for what felt like a very long stretch of seconds. My mother's hand, still resting on the table from her earlier toast, went very still. She looked at me the way you look at a sentence you're rereading to make sure you understood it the first time. $85,000, my father repeated, quietly, doing the same math I imagine everyone at that table was doing at exactly the same moment, the number nearly double what had just been announced, 20 minutes earlier, as a generous, defining gift to one daughter, from a daughter who, we'd all just been told in front of 40 people, had never really needed anyone. I told the hospital billing office I wanted it processed as a financial assistance adjustment, I said, quietly, to my mother directly, because I wasn't going to let Priscilla carry the rest of this alone after an honest mistake that was never really hers to apologize for. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. I didn't want it to be about me at all. I just wanted Dad to come home from that hospital without the two of you having to remortgage a house you'd spent 30 years paying off. My mother's face did something I had genuinely never seen it do before, not anger, and not quite shame either, something closer to a kind of vertigo. The specific feeling of a floor you'd been standing on for 4 years turning out to have never actually been the floor you thought it was. You let me thank a hospital, she said, for something you did. You let me say that to everyone. At Thanksgiving, I told the whole family how grateful I was to a charity program that never existed. I didn't correct you because it wasn't about being thanked, I said. It never was. It still isn't. Priscilla, still standing, still holding her glass, looked genuinely stricken, glancing between me and my parents with the specific distress of a professional who has spent a career protecting confidences and has just, through nothing but affection and bad timing, broken one by accident in the worst possible room. "Larkin, I am so sorry," she said quietly, sitting back down. "I truly thought this was something you'd all worked through together. I would never have said a word if I'd known." I told her, and meant it, that there was nothing to apologize for, that 4 years of carrying a secret alone eventually finds its own way out, one way or another, and that I'd rather it came out through someone's genuine, well-meant affection than through any version I might have engineered myself. Marnie, across the table, had gone very quiet, her hand no longer resting on our mother's, her expression cycling through something I couldn't fully read, not resentment toward me, I don't think, but a genuine recalibration of 4 years she lived through, believing she understood the full shape of what our family had survived together. "You were there the whole time," she said, finally, to me, not accusingly, just working it out loud. "At the hospital, after. You never said anything. Not once." I didn't want it to be a competition, I told her, and I meant it completely. "You showing up every single week for 4 years is real, Marnie. It mattered more than money ever could, every single time. I just didn't want anyone to think I loved him less, because I couldn't be the one sitting in that waiting room chair." My father, who hadn't said much through any of this, finally reached across the table and took my hand, his grip firmer than I expected from a man 3 weeks out from his own retirement party. "I always wondered," he said, quietly, "why that hospital program never showed up again for anyone else I asked about it. I should have asked more questions. I think some part of me didn't want to, because the relief felt too good to poke at." He looked at me for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the money. For staying quiet about it for 4 years, so I wouldn't have to feel like I owed my own daughter $85,000 I couldn't have paid back." I didn't get a clean, tidy apology from my mother that night, standing in a rented banquet hall with a half-eaten sheet cake and 40 of my father's former coworkers, pretending not to have overheard any of it. What I got instead was smaller and, in its own way, far more honest. She called me 2 days later and asked if she could come by on her own, without my father, and when she arrived, she sat at my kitchen table and said, plainly, that she'd spent 36 hours replaying the sentence she'd said at that podium, and that she didn't think she could take it back so much as she needed me to understand she'd genuinely believed it when she said it, that some part of her had built an entire understanding of who I was around the fact that I'd never once, in 37 years, asked her for anything, and that she'd mistaken that for not needing anyone, rather than what it actually was, a decision I'd made, a long time ago, to carry my own weight quietly rather than hand it to people who already had enough to carry. "I don't think I ever once considered," she told me, turning a coffee mug slowly in her hands, "that the reason you never asked for help was the same reason you were capable of giving $85,000 of it without telling anyone. I thought those were 2 different daughters. I'm starting to understand they were always the same one." I told her that was enough. I've learned, watching this family work through hard things over the years, that the apologies which actually change something rarely arrive polished. They arrive exactly like that, turning a coffee mug a little late, working it out loud in real time, which is usually how you know they're real. My parents insisted, over the following weeks, on setting up a repayment structure for the $85,000 in careful monthly installments they managed themselves, not because I asked for it, but because my mother told me she needed the debt to belong to them again, visibly, rather than sitting invisibly as a kindness she hadn't known how to properly receive. I let her. Some gestures matter more for what they let the other person keep than for what they actually repay. Marnie and I had our own conversation, a few weeks later, over coffee, just the 2 of us, and I told her something I probably should have said years earlier, that I've never once resented her for being the daughter who shows up in person. Because showing up in person, week after week, for 30 years, is its own enormous, undervalued form of love, one I genuinely couldn't have given our parents even if I'd wanted to, given the life I chose. She told me, in turn, that she'd spent years quietly assuming my absence meant I cared less, and that she was only now starting to understand that love can travel through a wire transfer and an anonymous trust just as fully as it travels through a Tuesday afternoon spent fixing a leak under someone's sink. Neither of us fully closed that gap in one conversation. I don't think gaps built over 30 years close in one conversation. But we started. The hospital bill itself, the original one, marked paid in full in a stamp I requested specifically because some part of me wanted proof, sits in a folder in my home office, the one physical object connected to all of this. I've never framed it, never shown it to anyone before telling this story tonight. It was never meant to be evidence. It was just meant to be true, whether or not anyone else ever knew it. My mother asked me, that day at my kitchen table, whether I was angry with Priscilla for saying anything at all, and I told her honestly that I wasn't, not even a little, that if I'm being fully truthful with myself, some small, tired part of me had been quietly waiting for years for exactly a moment like that one, without ever being willing to engineer it myself. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the daughter people assume doesn't need anything, and I think, somewhere underneath the version of me that chose silence for 4 straight years, there was another version that simply wanted, eventually, to be known correctly, even if she never worked up the nerve to make that happen on purpose. My father retired properly the following month, and the two of them have since started, slowly, asking me more actual questions about my life when I visit, not just where I've flown or when I'm leaving again, but what the work is actually like. What a transatlantic night in the cockpit actually feels like at 3 in the morning somewhere over Greenland. I don't think one banquet hall toast rewired 37 years of family habit overnight. But I think it opened a door that had been quietly shut for a long time, and I think, on balance, I'm grateful it opened the way it did, even though I never would have chosen to open it that way myself. If there's a lesson in this one, I don't think it's really about being vindicated in front of a room full of people, even though, in the strangest way, I suppose I was. I think it's about the specific, unglamorous discipline of loving people quietly, in whatever form your own life actually allows, without needing that love translated into a language everyone around you already recognizes. Mine got translated anyway, that night, by a woman who never meant to say it out loud, and I'm still, honestly, working out how I feel about that. But I know this much. I'd make the same choice again, every single time, even knowing exactly how loud the room would eventually get. Thank you all so much for staying with me through this one tonight. If any part of this reached something in you, if you've ever loved someone quietly, in a form they didn't quite know how to recognize, or watched a room define you by an absence instead of by what you were actually building somewhere else, drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next story.